Hello, my name is Christopher Plotz. I am one of the founding members of Mosaic Players, and I would like to welcome you to this year's Advent calendar for Christmas of 2020. On this first day of it, I will be reading the first stave of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I hope you enjoy. A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas by Charles Dickens. I have endeavored, in this ghostly little book, to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything that he put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say what I know of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadliest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdoms of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country is done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for, I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm him, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon his purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather had nowhere to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect, They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him on the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come see me?" No. Beggars employed him to stow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all of his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blindsmen's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and they would wag their tails as though to say, "No eye at all is better than a dark eye, evil master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way through the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing one called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was a cold, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and the candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by, and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep an eye upon his clerk, who was in a little dismal cell beyond, a sort of tank, copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clock's fire was so much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clock came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself by the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that it was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah, humbug!" said Scrooge. He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas up, humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reasons have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready at the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug!" "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle. "When I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas? Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot that goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." "Uncle!" pleaded the nephew. "Nephew!" returned the uncle sternly.
Keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it? Repeated Scrooge's nephew. But you don't keep it.
Let me leave it alone, then, said Scrooge. Much good it may do you, much good it has ever done you.
There are many things from which I might have derived good, from which I have not profited, I dare say, returned the nephew. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure that I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of the people below them as if they were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite the powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first.
But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew.
Why?
Why did you get married? Said Scrooge.
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love,
growled Scrooge, as if it was the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a merry Christmas.
Good afternoon.
Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon,
said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon, said Scrooge.
I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party. But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle.
Good afternoon, said Scrooge.
And a Happy New Year.
Good afternoon, said Scrooge.
His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow greetings upon the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fellow, muttered Scrooge, overheard him. My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had led 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him.
Scrooge and Marley, I believe,
said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list.
Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley's been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night.
Well, we have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned, shook his head, and handed the credentials back.
At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds and thousands are in want of common comforts, sir.
Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge.
Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying the pen down again.
And the Union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation?
They are, still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law are still in full vigor, then? Said Scrooge.
Both very busy, sir.
Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time above all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing, Scrooge replied.
You wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you asked what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I cannot afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that.
But you might know it, observed the gentleman.
It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an approved opinion of himself, and a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages, and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible. It struck the hours and the quarters in the clouds, with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing gas pipes, and they had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winkling their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The ice plug being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the heat lamp of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades become a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, and his lean wife and the baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold, If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed on by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sounds of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the young singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house had arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactfully admitted the fact to his expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It is not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'd be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work?" The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said the Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blindman's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner with his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of a building up a yard where it had little business to be, that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with the other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation upon the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all peculiar about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. It is also said that Scrooge has had as little what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 dead years' partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having put his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but it had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon his ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, in its livid color, made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key that he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it at first, as if he half expected to be terrified by the sight of Marley's pig's tail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Peh, peh," and closed it with a bang. You may vaguely talk about driving a coach and six up a good flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say you might have gotten a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and had done it easily. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was a pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under a table, nobody under a sofa. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel — Scrooge had a cold upon his head — upon the knob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like featherbeds, Abrahams, Balthazars, apostles putting off to sea in buttered boats. Hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like an old prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first, with the power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room, and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was, with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that, as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the onset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person was dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
"It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it."
His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Molly's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Molly in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Molly had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief around his head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses.
"How now?"
said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever.
"What do you want with me?"
"Much." Molly's voice, no doubt about it.
"Who are you?"
"Ask me who I was."
"Who were you, then?"
said Scrooge, raising his voice.
"You're particular for a shade."
He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley."
Can you sit down?"
asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him.
"I can."
"Do it, then."
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and that felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it.
"You don't believe in me,"
observed the ghost.
"I don't,"
said Scrooge.
"What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?"
"I don't know,"
said Scrooge.
"Why do you doubt your senses?"
"Because,"
said Scrooge,
"a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are."
Scrooge was not much in the habit of crackling jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any waggish means then. The truth is, he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed him to the very marrow of his bones. To sit staring at those fixed-gazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of his own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair, skirts, and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven.
"You see this toothpick?"
said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though, if it was only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself.
"I do,"
replied the ghost.
"You're not looking at it,"
said Scrooge.
"But I see it,"
said the ghost, notwithstanding.
"Well,"
returned Scrooge,
"I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!"
At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry. It shook its chain with such dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face.
"Mercy!" he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?"
"Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?"
"I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?"
"It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness."
Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands.
"You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why."
"I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?"
Scrooge trembled more and more.
"Or would you know,"
pursued the ghost,
"the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full, as heavy, and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain."
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
"Jacob,"
he said imploringly.
"Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob."
"I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers
to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and the weary journeys lie before me.
It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off of his knees.
"You must have been very slow about it, Jacob,"
Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference.
Slow?
The ghost repeated.
7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and traveling all the time.
The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse.
You travel fast,
said Scrooge.
On the wings of the wind,
replied the ghost.
You might have got to cover a great quantity of grounds in 7 years, said Scrooge.
The ghost, upon hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance.
"O captive, bound in double iron," cried the phantom, "not to know the ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit, working its kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I."
"But you were always a good man of business, Jacob,"
faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself.
"Business?"
cried the ghost, wringing its hands again.
"Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business."
It held its chain up at arm's length, as if that were the cause of its unavailing grief, and it flung it heavily upon the ground again.
"At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode, where there were no homes to which its light would have conducted me?"
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
"Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is almost gone."
I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray."
"How it is that I appear before you in a shape you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day."
This was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
"That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer."
"You are always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye."
"You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 Spirits? Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice.
It is.
I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge.
Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge.
Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us.
When he had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it around his head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound his teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of one another, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for the moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity, and looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together, none were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at not being able to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery was with them all, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost that power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, and he locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Well, thanks for sitting and listening with me. We will be doing the other 4 staves. You're going to have to check each day to find out when they're on again. All these videos will be available once they are played through the end of the year. Have a happy holidays from myself and from Mosaic Players, and have a good day.